Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives. All right. Today on Good Sex at NYU, we are joined by Stephen Azo Michels, they, them, who is a senior area manager for the post-production center at the Tisch School of the Arts Film and TV program. They are also an adjunct instructor at Tisch School of the Arts, teaching video editing and tech theory. They hold degrees in film and TV production, higher education administration, educational technology and communications, and global affairs and transnational security. As a director, producer, editor, and photographer, they have several awards and have screened at Sundance, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Brooklyn Museum, the ICA London, and others. They are currently engaged in projects that utilize technology in fostering peace, deconstructing, othering, and understanding the continuums of personal beliefs that defy the dichotomous frameworks fostered on society by the media and government. Thank you so much for joining us. That's quite a bio. And before we started recording, you were mentioning being in school, and it sounds like you are a lifelong learner, which is admirable.
Well, also, all those things sound really fascinating. So
Yes.
I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So our first question is always just, what is one thing that you enjoy about being part of the NYU community?
Well, I'm very fortunate to work at Tisch School of the Arts, and especially in the Department of Film and TV, where many of us have been there for a very long period of time. And so it's very familial. Some of the people that I've worked with have been there for my whole career, which has spanned 38 years in October. This coming up in a couple of days, actually. Yeah,
it's amazing.
And but even the new people, they sort of really fall into a friendly relationship, you know, in addition to the work atmosphere. So it actually makes it a really enjoyable place to come to work.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely. So we want to try to make this an equitable space, right? And so if at any point you want to turn any of these questions around on us, please feel free. We know that this is a vulnerable conversation at times, and so we're willing to be there with you. Also, if there's a boundary that, you know, we cross with a question, then you can also say, you know, I'm going to pass on that, and we'll definitely honor your boundaries in that as well.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of boundaries, as you'll see, but, you know, I'm also going to try to, I'm also cognizant of the fact that people I work with and people that are my students might hear this, so I might self-edit myself a little bit, but we'll see what happens.
Fair. All right. Well, so we're going to start with a question about the broader culture and how that may have influenced your personal choices in life, dating, and sex. This could be TV, media, anything growing up or in your current life.
So I am going to be turning 62 in November, which I've only started actually admitting that out loud recently. So I was born in the early 60s. I grew up in the 70s. And I was thinking about some of the cultural references that were around back then. It definitely was the dawn of gay liberation. So that was definitely something that I was aware of. I grew up with a brother who was in very close age to me, and we have different birth parents, and he's a person of color. So I remember we were also kind of looking at racial injustices and things like that, and just being aware of basic injustice, really, and thinking that why isn't everybody sort of equal and free? You know, this is, you know, early 70s, mid 70s. And I remember watching Soap and the Billy Crystal character Jody, which was like one of the first gay characters that was on TV, and all of the conflama that was surrounding that. Like, you know, people, the religious people were outraged that there was this gay character on TV, and the gays were mad because it was this sort of one-dimensional character that was being shown on TV. And so I definitely remember fostering a feeling that I wasn't quite right. Like there was just something that wasn't normal, or society thought wasn't normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And how has that like transferred or sort of evolved over time? Have you taken that in and internalized that? Have you unpacked that?
Well, there definitely was a phrase that was bandied about pretty widely in the 80s called internalized homophobia, which is, you know, there's different groups now that are using it to help them process the way they feel about themselves, like people of color. I think there's that conversation happening that society puts different groups down so much that they can't help but feel that, you know, so that was something. And also in the early to mid 80s and late 80s, the AIDS crisis that was happening, that was also kind of compounded that feeling of othering and otherness. But I think that a lot of my work has always kind of centered around equality and wanting marginalized groups to have the same rights as the majority of any population. Like I remember very clearly the ERA that was happening when I grew up, and being like, yeah, you know, my sisters definitely should have equal rights. Like, why is that not in there? And like, how is this not immediately being enacted by every state in the union? And then when it failed, I was just appalled, you know. But that was...
Yeah, it's still shocking that the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't been passed.
Right.
This
50 years
yeah,
later.
50 years later. So it's incredible. But I mean, you're speaking to some of the like institutions as well that can be oppressive, the media, our government. Are there other like institutions that you find that have been oppressive in your like sexual and relationship journey?
There definitely are. The church, the Catholic Church that I grew up with, is obviously extremely oppressive. And there's two incidents that happened in my life that were sort of poignant for me. When I did my confirmation classes, so I was about 12 or 13, my teacher was, I would say, effeminate. And I remember my parents having this conversation at dinner table about how he was funny. And I had just finished the class, and I had gotten 100 on my confirmation test. And I was the only one in my class who did. And my mother, or I think it was probably my mother, because she was a little bit more opinionated out loud about those kind of things, said, you know, he was kind of funny. And I was like, well, I got 100 on my confirmation test, so he's probably a pretty good teacher. And she's like, yeah, but he's a little funny. I'm like, I got 100 on my confirmation test. And so
Good for you.
So she dropped that conversation. And the other one was around the same time, my brother and I were hemming and hawing about going to church one Sunday because it was just so dreadfully boring. And my mother taught at the school that was part of the church, and my father was one of the ushers at the mass. So they couldn't really be late. And so my mother said to me and my brother, if you can give me one good reason why you don't want to go to church, you don't have to go to church. And so what I answered was, and I don't know where this came from, but it obviously was seriously internalized. I said, God is with me right here. And I'm pointing to my chest. I said, you know, God is inside me. So I don't need to go to church to be with God. I can be with God anytime I want. And my mother turned to me and said, you don't have to go to church. And so,
Well done.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, you know, in you internalized that like God was with you, and were you getting any messages from the church brought more broadly about sexuality or about sex or relationships that you kind of took in that impacted you, or did you always feel like God was really with you and supporting you?
The two for me are very, very separate. I think everybody has their own individual path towards spirituality and their relationship with their God versus organized religion, which has its important part in society. It certainly is a place where people can go and have a community. There's rituals. I love the pageantry of a church. Like whenever I travel, I definitely go to churches and other places of worship just to sort of see their art, and the smell is also really interesting to me. I love the smell of incense, and I love lighting candles and things like that. So I understand that community aspect because it's important. It might be the only time people actually commune in a friendly way with their neighbors. They're so often combative with our neighbors. They're either like something they're growing in their yard is falling in my yard, or they're too loud. But when you go to church, it's kind of those pretenses come down a little bit. So I think that there's a good place for organized religion. I do remember like the Pope I love the Pope. I was a big Pope watcher. And when Pope John Paul II was around, I saw him in person about 12 times.
Oh, wow.
Him and Queen Elizabeth were two people I sort of stalked. And the energy that they both emitted when you were in their presence was just remarkable. Like you could feel it. It was palpable. And, it's the energy of a community. And we've all been in those sort of situations. Like if everyone in the group is afraid, you can feel that fear, and the same thing, like you could feel the outpouring of love for those people when you were in the same room with them. So it was kind of interesting. But at the same time, he would often or occasionally say things that were really, negative. I was like, well, I'll take this and I'll leave that. And that's okay with me because I'm me and they're them. And as long as they don't, step on my back, I'm okay.
Yeah. So, I don't know, just these two sides of the church for you or religion for you, like some having like some harmful ideas and beliefs, but also like there's the positive and like the community. I'm really kind of connecting with that. I had someone recently, I was talking to some folks and trying to make friends. As you get older, it's like, oh, there is a place for like church. Like there are times where I wish that I, had that kind of connection or had that kind of belief, because it is a place where people come together on something that they believe. But I do struggle with how some of those like ideas are, continue to swirl around in that space that can be harmful. And so I'm just connecting with you on that I think that, a lot of people might feel that there's some benefit, but there's also some harm there.
Well, what's ironic is that there's a test that you take in high school. I want to say it's called Briggs-Myers or Myers-Briggs, and it's a vocation test to see what you're what you're best suited to be when you grow up. And so when I took the test, my outcome was that I was either going to be a teacher or a priest. And I was like, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing in the whole world. And ironically, I became both. So I am a reverend. I marry people. I'm a marriage officiant. But, I also have a very strong sense of my spirituality and things like that. And I'm also a teacher, which is kind of funny.
Well, I also think that in some ways, like they're both kind of teachers.
Yes.
So
listeners, people that help you move from one place to another, hopefully in a positive way.
Yeah. So I don't think I got to take that test when I was younger. I would be interested.
So if we can like maybe pry a little more into the personal, if you could tell us, as you've talked a lot about different pieces of your childhood and your upbringing, and tell us a little bit about like how your like sexuality and understanding of sex and relationships was kind of developing along with you in those years.
I definitely have evolved a lot from then until now in terms of the way that I view sexuality and my own sexuality. I was sort of a very late bloomer in a lot of ways. When I went to college, that was sort of where I awakened more to those types of things. I think initially I was a little ashamed of it and things like that, but the internalized homophobia that I mentioned, and also the AIDS crisis didn't help because it was just so scary to engage in sexual practices with another person, and that was pretty frightening. And at the time, I was also anorexic, and so I was very thin, and so people who would look at me would think one thing when that wasn't true, but nonetheless, it also kept a lot of people at bay. But when I finally did sort of come into my own in terms of being more comfortable with my sexuality, I think it's something that it's an inherent and natural part of any person. And it's interesting too that a lot of religious tenets do sort of promote it. They do engage positive sexual interaction, usually in procreation and developing families and things like that. But there's also, if you read between the lines, they also talk about how it should be enjoyable. It's not always just for procreating. So I think that that's kind of an interesting takeaway from religious tenet that isn't always the way people interpret it.
Well, I always think of it as pleasurable for the man, and whenever the man wants it, and all those things. Maybe that's just my internalized.
Well, perhaps
issues.
One day when women have equal rights, in this country and around the world, we can turn that around.
Well, also maybe because some of the authors of some of the religions and some of the books are historically or have historically been male identified, that maybe even in some of those scripts it can come off as more pleasurable or more fun for the any male having sex, right? Versus again, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on any of those texts, but I think historically they've been written from that perspective, and so it might be hard for them to write from a perspective of a woman.
Well, I think the way a lot of people have sort of developed their own sense of God and spirituality, and there are small groups, I think, that sort of follow those sort of ideas, but I think that the fact that we have more of this individual spirituality or sense of spirituality that, we can develop what our own God looks like and acts like and thinks like and tells us, and to move through the world in a peaceful manner that allows us to enjoy interacting with other people, whether it be, just on a personal level or a sexual level or an emotional level, intellectual level, whatever it is, and engaging the world in a positive way. So I think that it's happening.
Yeah.
But the organized religions, I doubt that they're ever going to catch up. Maybe at least the older ones, I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Do you feel comfortable sharing more about your eating disorder? Is that something that we can touch on, or is that something you prefer not to discuss?
It's I definitely don't mind talking about it because whenever I have talked about it in settings, I know it's important for other male-identified people to hear that they exist. And very often, BDD, which is body dysmorphia disorder in young males, engages itself in not thinking that they're muscular enough. So it's actually the opposite. But I was anorexic, and I never thought that I was skinny enough. And I remember I still sort of have it, which is kind of ironic. I have like this tiny little gut that I had when I was young, and it has always bothered me. It's never gone anywhere. Somehow I think, even at my current age, I think that somehow it's miraculously going to go away, and I'm going to have like that flat 17-year-old stomach. But so I'm kind of still coming to terms with that.
Yeah.
So it's still there. It's not, you don't ever recover from anorexia. I was not bulimic, but I don't think you ever recover from it, but you can be recovering. Those sort of mental disorders, I think, never really go away. And it's really more of a maintenance situation. So I I never really liked to eat. I ate there were many years I ate very, very little. I remember there was at least a whole year when the only thing I ate was a slice of pizza a day, which luckily has 3 out of the 4 food groups. But it probably was not enough to sustain me in any manner. And oddly, I didn't lose or gain weight during that period. So it was kind of odd. But one of the things, I'll talk about it from a more positive sense, one of the things that I started to do, which I try to do today, is I try to sit down when I eat. I try to take my meals at a table, use silverware, use plates, to make it, more of a ritual. And, so when I have breakfast in the morning, I make my breakfast and I sit at the table and I eat it. And sometimes I'll try to actually be doing just eating when I do it. That's a little harder. I'm often looking at my phone or watching TV or whatever, but just to actively do that one thing. And an interesting experiment that I want you both to try is to take an almond. Do you like almonds?
Yeah.
Do you like almonds? To take an almond and chew it for at least 60 seconds. And it tastes different at least 2 or 3, sometimes 4 times during the course of that, as it sort of changes consistency and different flavors are released. It's actually really interesting how each individual taste is incredibly delicious on its own. But usually when we eat a nut, we sort of chew it the minimal amount of times to swallow it. But if you take time to follow through and just really taste it, it's a very, very different experience.
Yeah. It sounds like mindful eating and just kind of being aware and like being able to think of like, as I'm chewing this food, what it's doing for your body, and just being appreciative of the body that you have and the way that the food can nourish your body.
And we often recommend that with not just people who experience any kind of eating behaviors that might be harmful, but also people who struggle with any kind of like active mind that's difficult to settle. If you can do some things that are, slow things down. And one of them I will often recommend, really sort of take the item in your hand, feel the texture, like smell it, put it in your mouth, really chew it and think about the flavors, really then swallow it, think about what it gives to your body, right? That's slowing things down. And I think it's a good strategy. But also just want to say, thank you for sharing, because I do know that it is important for people to see that it's, experiencing an eating disorder isn't one thing or one way. And it isn't in one body or one gender or, any of those things. And so I think it's really helpful to sort of hear from someone directly about what their experience is like.
Yeah, I think definitely I hear it being talked about in a much broader sense over the past, 10 years or so, which is really important and helpful, I think.
Yeah.
But I know, I think one of the things that we're talking about, and this show obviously explores good sex and that aspect of our whole being, whereas you can engage each of your areas in that same way, to really slow them down and to enjoy them for what they are, the person that you're with, and the, eating, sleeping, whatever it is you're doing, to just be sort of mindful and enjoying that particular act.
Yeah. We talk about that. We had a guest on talking about sensate focus, and really the like touching up either your own body or somebody else's body more mindfully, and not necessarily even for traditional parts that bring pleasure. So avoiding the genitals or breasts or things like that, and really just trying to find other parts of your body that produce pleasure that you don't even know because you haven't spent the time to kind of explore. And so that also takes the time to slow down, be mindful of what you're feeling in your body, what you're feeling in your gut as somebody else is touching in a specific place, or you're touching yourself in that place. And yeah, I think that can be really, really beneficial. If you're just so used to a certain act a certain way, or like having an orgasm a certain way, just really like focusing on the different kinds of pleasure and different parts of the body that can bring pleasure in a sexual or non-sexual way.
Well, I think the way this really connects is that we also have to feel comfortable with our own body and where we're at in this given moment. And that means touching ourselves, like feeling comfortable with like, where does pleasure land in my body? How do we show up? How do we engage in sex if we're feeling uncomfortable in our body, right? Because I think we all have a journey. And so it's important for us to be mindful that things like pain in our body, or, eating disorders, or how body image, image can really impact how we engage, in sex, but also in relationships. And so I think it's important because a lot of things intersect with sex and relationships.
I was actually reading this article. Well, we talked earlier about how time is more liquid than it used to be, and so this could have been a year ago or 10 years ago. But I was reading this article recently, and it was about the difference between the way Americans view naked bodies and other cultures, like specifically like Scandinavian cultures, where going to a sauna and being naked with other genders is sort of the norm. And what they were saying is it's super important for younger people to see that, to see other people just be comfortable with their bodies and what they actually look like. And, what we see in the media of naked bodies or semi-naked bodies is not what bodies really look like. They're not airbrushed, they're not retouched and all those kind of things.
They don't have great lighting.
Yeah. And so it's important to just sort of see other people comfortable in their bodies and have that sort of as a role model. Whereas here in the United States, you go to the gym and everyone's like sort of hiding from each other, and it's just like, what are you ashamed of? It's kind of odd to me.
My sister and I went to a spa last year, maybe almost a year ago, and it was same sex like locker rooms, but within that locker room they had pools, and you could go into those pools, and there was a sign in front of the pools that said no clothing beyond this sign. And so you weren't supposed to wear any clothes. And my sister and I, we kind of like decided to be brave. And I was less than 2 months postpartum, and so not necessarily totally comfortable with my body, the new body. And we go, and like half of the people there are wearing bathing suits. And we just thought, there's clearly a sign here that says no clothing beyond here. And we were trying to just, embrace that and be there and be present in our bodies. And it just was sort of like everybody that was wearing a bathing suit, were they ashamed of their body? Were they judging us for our bodies? And it was just it was a totally different dynamic. And so it's really interesting that
how did that impact your wanting to sort of explore being naked in public? How did that impact that experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was definitely more self-conscious at first, and then we were in the water and sort of like, okay, well now my body is kind of hidden in this water, but it felt nice on my body to have no restriction of the clothes, right? It was sort of like, okay, well I'm just here in the water and I can be more comfortable. I was definitely more comfortable than having a bathing suit on. So it did take a minute.
And making sure things are staying up.
Exactly. Yeah. So it took a minute to get there, but then I sort of was like, well, we're enjoying this probably more than they are. So.
What are some key interpersonal relationships that has shaped how you view sex and relationships?
So I think when I was younger, my relationships and my value as a sexual partner was very, what is the word I'm looking for? Transactional, definitely transactional. Whether, not necessarily being paid for it, although I have done that, but more, you buy me drinks or buy me dinner or something like that. It was, I got something from the experience of letting you have access to my body. And I understood very quickly that being a young, sexually attractive person, that was a commodity that had value. So as I've gotten older, the commodity value has changed. I mean, it still exists, which I'm very fortunate for, that I have a very vibrant sex life at this point in my life. I do see a lot of people around me that are my age and things like this where like they've kind of put that to the side, and I'm like, how would you give up that part of your personality? But I think everybody has a different sense of their wholeness, and maybe that's just, that wasn't important to them then, and it's not important to them now, and maybe they were just sort of going through the motions because they felt they had to, or what. I'm not going to judge them for that, but I do feel that because it's such, I think of it as such a God-given thing that we have to be able to engage with another human being in that intimate way, that it's such a gift that why would you want to not explore that? So I had a lot of failed relationships along the way. I've had a couple of very long relationships, but they were more just sort of two people taking care of each other than they were sexual relationships. Like, that part of the puzzle never really fit with that person for me. Not to say that it won't someday, and that certainly would be nice, but for the most part, those two have sort of existed in separate realms.
And having those two separate realms and being able to see those things as two separates, either a sexual relationship or a caring partnership, do you feel like that's impacted the way that you approach seeking relationships or seeking sexual relationships?
I think that there's a lot of like-minded people in the world right now. So it's not hard to find another person that is looking for an intimate sexual relationship, or long-term or short-term, whatever it is. And so and engaging just in finding pleasure, not just pleasure for yourself, but pleasure for both people at the same time. And I find that there's a lot of people that are like that. So it's actually not that difficult to find like-minded people, which is, I'm lucky. I live in New York City. When I travel, I often travel to large cities. If I was in the middle of the country in some small town, it obviously would be a lot more difficult to have that same sort of experiences or be able to engage in that sort of sense of self. But
yeah.
Well, I also think that we often feel, and I say broader culture as well as sometimes me personally in my own experience, is that if a relationship isn't still ongoing and we've ended it, that it's a failure. And I think that I grow so much at times from some of those relationships, and I've taken a lot for myself in the growth, and so it may not have worked out, and there might have been some harm, there might have been some really negative things, but as a result, I've also grown, and I figured out more what I want in the next person, perhaps, that I might engage with, whether that's sexual casually or more exclusive or open. I've learned so much along the way that, I love the idea of shifting that language to say that I'm not necessarily a failure, because I struggle with the fact that I'm in my 40s, I haven't been married, all these things that the culture sort of places on me. But I'm like, you know what? I wouldn't change things. I've learned so much from all of the people, and they've all failed according to society standards, right? But I'm also I kind of love my life, so I wouldn't go back and change that. But I feel like the society putting that failure language on me, is tough to get through. But I've learned so much from everyone that I've had encounters with.
Yeah, I've had. If I could write a very, very long book about all of the experiences I've had, and not all of them have been positive. Some of them have been extremely traumatic and negative, and all of those things. But when I look back, all of those things have made me who I am today, and I'm very happy with who I am today. And if any of those things were to have changed, I wouldn't be this same person. So I'm very thankful for all of the things that have happened to me, even the negative ones, because I also can't change them.
Right.
So I either can look back and regret them, or I can accept them and say, okay, well, that happened, and how can I take something positive away from it? What can I learn about myself? What can I learn about other people from that? But the other piece of it is it doesn't really formulate what it is I'm looking for, because I just sort of think trying to be as open as possible to what comes toward me and meeting it there rather than I was speaking to a friend this morning and they were seeing somebody new and they were sort of future tripping on it and they were joking about the fact that that's what they do, and I said, just enjoy now, just enjoy what you have. And so if it becomes something more than that, or even if the two of you decide to move in a way together in a mutual way, that's great. But I definitely try to not think, oh, I would love to have this, and this, because then I feel like I would always be disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think there's an openness that is helpful, but I also think that I've learned that what I need is maybe to be more open, right? Or maybe what I need is someone who is curious like me. And that can be for a lot of things, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be, I need someone who ticks some boxes that are maybe a little bit ridiculous. I still struggle with the height. I'm still working on that one. But like, so like there's still a couple of those there. But I also think that it's something about curiosity and emotional intelligence that maybe at the younger me was a little bit more focused on the superficial. I'm like, oh, he's cute. Or, oh, like, I think that's what I'm talking about when I think about like I've learned and this is what I'm looking for in the sense of like, I have to trust my gut. I know I had something recently. I was like, oh, there's some flags here, but I want to be open. I want to like just enjoy this moment, but also there's some flags, and there's like the balancing act between the two.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, definitely the first one is the skinniness. Definitely that's the first thing that I'm attracted to. So for obvious reasons from what we talked about.
Yeah.
But so that does exist for sure.
Yeah. I know we don't have time for you to tell us your whole book, but are there any stories you feel like could be beneficial to our listeners that you feel like, oh, this is a great one, that I learned this one thing, or this was a really heartwarming lesson, or something that you feel like could be beneficial?
Or maybe what would the title of this book be if you were to write it?
Well, at this point in my life, the book that I want to write is called, I just lost the name of it. Hold on a second. I haven't thought about it in so long now.
I'll tell you mine. It's Dinner with My Vibrator.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, I got it. So the name of my book would be Fill in the Pages. And what it is people that I've known through my history telling me stories about times that we've been together that I no longer remember or that I don't remember in intimate detail. And so just sort of, it's like when you look at a photograph and you're like, oh, I remember that sort of thing, except in words. Some of the things that I've learned are out calls, don't do in calls. So I rarely will have someone back to my house at first anyway. So, and I think that that's just a little bit of fear, but also, that this way I can leave when I need to leave or, hopefully be able to leave when I want to leave.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a weird thing to have learned from series of interactions and relationships. But there isn't really one that stands out. And I've had a lot of people that loved me unconditionally, and I think that was super important for me, especially in times of my life when I didn't love myself unconditionally. I know that in a few of my relationships, the person that was with me was almost intentionally not seeing my flaws because they wanted to focus on what the positive aspects. And so I think that was a really important lesson as well. It's like the flaws aren't nearly as important sometimes as the positive aspects. Whether they squeeze the toothpaste tube from the middle, I can just start squeezing it from the bottom and move on. So.
Yeah.
As a recovering perfectionist, that really resonates with me, and I'm still learning how to just move on and not say what I'm thinking inside.
It is very hard, and it's also very hard to not make the Larry comment, the backhanded, passive aggressive comment, like just to get it in there. But it's much better often left unsaid.
That's funny. Yeah. Have you experienced any internal messages that have affected your ability to foster relationships that have, in exploring your sexuality as well? I mean, we talked a little bit about that earlier, like some of that, internalized homophobia, but have there been any other, like, and maybe that wasn't something you experienced. We were talking about that in the context of like the church, but I'm curious if there's any other internalized messages that you have carried and you've unpacked.
The ones that really worry me now, although I don't necessarily fall into this category, but all of the negative communication about trans people and about using other bathrooms is just insanity to me. Because like when I travel, if I go to a concert, you very often will see the women lined up to use the men's room because the women's room is too crowded. And I don't have a problem with that. And it's also often this playful sort of interaction. And it's kind of funny because, we're so pent up about gender and sex in the United States. It doesn't really exist in a lot of other places, but also just the lack of historical context about trans people. And I was thinking recently that when I was young, there were tomboys and sissy boys that definitely today would fall under that label. And back then, we sort of made fun of them, but we were still their friends. But now there's sort of this very heightened awareness of them and like, they're going to harm our children, or we've all been there. We've always been here. There's always been this continuum of I think we're getting hung up in the use of the word gender and gender identity. I just think that those are the wrong terms to be using to describe the continuum that exists between what society sees as masculine and feminine. Most people are very much, the most masculine Marine father is going to cry when his daughter is born. And like, does that make him less of a man? Or, does that make him something other than that? And I think that we need to stop thinking of each other in these dichotomous roles. That's really harmful, I think, not only for myself, but for especially young people, I think.
Well, and I think that making fun of and causing harm when someone does, like if that father does cry, are there people around him that are making fun of him and shaming him, right? I think that's where like we still get caught up, and I wish that we would let that go because it's normal. It's also normal to cry at a movie or like whatever else like a man can cry at. They should be allowed to cry without having that audience shaming them, because then they do internalize that. Oh, I can't be that. And then it comes out in different ways that can also be harmful. So I think that allowing space for people who are masculine to also be feminine and vice versa, but as someone who probably presents to the world as more feminine, allowing space for those masculine folks to be whoever and however they want, right? And again, I think that I hear you like as well on like we should, not be so like firmly held to these things, but I also think we need to unpack that like it's still internalized within a lot of people, and to, sometimes we lightheartedly make fun of people, it's like, oh, haha, but I think that can also be internalized, and so we just have to be really careful that we're not validating someone's fears about how they're presenting in the world.
Yeah, I like to think that that younger people are more aware and cognizant of the fact that there is this exploratory period that goes on during adolescence that is just sort of normal, and it doesn't make you one thing or another, or it's okay to be somewhere in the middle, or to not know. I think that there's certainly more awareness of it, which I think makes people be like, okay, well, when I hear somebody talk that way about it, that's just kind of their opinion. It's not what society as a whole feels like. Obviously, I'm hearing about it. So therefore there are people who don't think that way. And I think that that's great and positive.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think that like as the younger people get older, hopefully things will change. But like you're saying, if there's always been kids that live in the various degrees of the spectrum and we're still where we are today, that when the young people get old, there's something ingrained in society. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? These messages that are coming from the government and the media, and a lot of it's fear-mongering, but a lot of, the adults maybe forget what it was like when they were kids and that exploration period. And so it's sort of like we're in this perpetual cycle, and I do think it's getting better, and I hope it continues to get better. My son is almost 1, and I just hope that by the time he is in school and reaching that exploration phase, that I have not forgotten that is there, and that he'll feel free to have that phase as well.
I'm convinced that's happening.
I think it's incremental, but
if you just look at nail polish,
that's true.
That is certainly a very visible sign that people of all genders are comfortable with that. And it's not. So, yeah.
Well, I feel like I would love it to be this big, huge change, but I think we have to settle for the incremental and be like, okay, it's going to be slower than I would like, but it's still happening. Like you can definitely see the shift in generations. And so it's really exciting, but not as fast as I would like.
Well, I mentioned Soap, which was a sitcom that was on in the 70s, I think. And that was the first gay character. Now, you look at movies and television, there's almost always a gay character. There's there's very often
and leads too, not just like the side character, which I think is really helpful to be like, I can lead this narrative, I can lead this plot.
So we've moved the needle pretty far.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the fact that they are gay is not the only part of their story.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's just a part of who they are.
Yeah. So we're at our last question.
Okay.
What does good sex mean to you?
That is a great question. That good sex to me is really when two people are both in unison, sort of enjoying each other, and both sort of being aware of the other person's pleasure and displeasure, and making sure that it's not just one person or the other person, but it's the two together that's sort of making that magical experience. And I think that it happens fairly often, I think, especially today. I think a lot more people are, you were talking about, the way sort of I think of like the 50s, the way that people had sex is like the man would come in and like have sex to his wife, and the wife would be like, okay, just like waiting desperately for it to be over. Whereas now I think there's a lot more, oh, do you like this? Oh, yeah, okay, let me do that. And, a little bit more conversation and engagement, and it's not this act that culminates in orgasm. There's a phrase that's used quite often, edging, which is just sort of getting almost there. And to me, what that really means is, and I want to make this point too, is that for a man and possibly for a woman as well, ejaculation and orgasm are two separate events. So you can have an orgasm without ejaculating. And I think that that's kind of what edging is all about, and enjoying that with another person and getting both people to that point and then being able to continue. That to me is good sex.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. We've really enjoyed having you. I love just hearing other people's stories. On the surface, it may not seem like you and I have a ton in common, but I feel like I learned so much from you, and I know that our listeners will also enjoy hearing about your experiences. And since you do teach classes, where can people find you, either in an office, or what classes do you teach if people want to take any of your classes?
Well, I'm at Tisch School of the Arts in the film department, and I teach the editing portion of the freshman frame and sequence class. But I also teach tech seminars and video editing to other classes in the undergraduate realm. Awesome. But there or around the art world.
Yeah. Do you have any shows coming up or anything that you're working on?
Not at the moment. I do not. Nope.
All right. Well, we'll keep an eye out for your book.
Okay, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Vaini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellum, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.